Conversion therapy is currently a major topic of public conversation, with the United States Supreme Court poised to decide on the constitutionality of conversion therapy bans for minors this summer. Religious groups are split on the matter, with many arguing that conversion therapy is necessary to support the religious rights and goals of many Americans, while others argue that the practice is ineffective and harmful both psychologically and spiritually. But what is conversion therapy, and where does it come from? And what's its historical relationship to Christianity and to Catholicism in particular? In this discussion, I'll do a very deep dive into these questions. I'll cover the philosophical underpinnings, the psychological history, the theories behind, and the practices coming out of conversion therapy. This is going to be a pretty lengthy discussion, but I think it's a very important conversation for the church. Conversion therapy shows up in the church in many ways today and has impacted just about every LGBTQ plus Catholic in some way, whether we realize it or not. And if you stick around to the end, you'll learn how conservative promotion of conversion therapy actually has its origins in liberal secular psychoanalysis that treated religion itself as a neurosis. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Damian. I'm a gay Catholic, a writer, and a lawyer who's been digging into these issues for years. You may know me through my Instagram account where I facilitate conversations around hard topics in the church, or through my Substack, or now this YouTube channel. So let's hop into today's discussion. A few caveats to start out. First, the history and background of conversion therapy and its related ideologies is very complex and can be covered only in a partial form here. This is not intended to be an exhaustive overview, but an introduction, even if a lengthy introduction, and grounding for further discussion and exploration. I hope you can use this as a basis for discussion with your friends, family members, church community, and others. Second, I know a lot about the history and theories in this space. I'm someone who spent probably thousands, maybe tens of thousands of hours exploring these questions, partly out of an intellectual desire to understand and partly as a matter of personal survival. And as I've studied these questions, I've engaged philosophers, theologians, psychologists, conversion therapy survivors, and many others for feedback and insights. But I'm not a licensed therapist, and to the extent you take what I'm sharing here and seek to apply parts of it to your own life, especially the parts related to therapeutic practice, I'd really recommend doing it with trusted friends, mentors, and to the extent needed, licensed mental health professionals. Finally, I'm not speaking on behalf of everyone who's experienced or been impacted by conversion therapy or sexual orientation change efforts. For a variety of reasons, this explainer is particularly focused on conversion therapy as it relates to non-heterosexual males. More voices are needed. While diverse voices have been included as a part of this, I don't represent all the voices necessary to understand and respond to conversion therapy and the ideology supporting it. Conversion therapy can show up very differently in different communities. I hope that this can be a starting point for more spaces to open up and bring in much more needed representation. If you've experienced conversion therapy, especially in the context of Catholic spaces, and are open to sharing, I'd love to hear from you. Probably the easiest way to reach out to me would be at my Instagram account at @CDamianWrites. So, what is conversion therapy? Let's get into it. Discussing conversion therapy presents a variety of challenges. For one thing, a variety of practices have been considered under the umbrella of this term, including psychotherapy, talk therapy, group therapy, life coaching, shock or aversion therapy, spiritual or biblical counseling, pastoral counseling, healing ministries, spiritual healing efforts, retreats, and self-efforts. To capture a broad range of practices and not limit discussion of harmful change efforts to traditional forms of one-on-one therapy, some use the term sexual orientation change efforts, or SOCI, or the broader term sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. Secondly, various terms have been used at times to discuss what is commonly understood as conversion therapy. For example, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Sr., who many consider the father of contemporary ex-gay movements and conversion therapy, called his practice reparative therapy. Nicolosi's son then developed on his father's work, adopting the term reintegrative therapy for his own practice. Some challenge labeling the range of SOCI practices as conversion therapy, even when they consist of one-on-one sessions with trained individuals to seek sexual orientation change. For example, the Reintegrative Therapy Association, RTA, run by Nicolosi Jr., argues that coercion is a necessary component of conversion therapy, and thus its practices cannot be labeled as such. It says, quote, "It should be noted that the APA's ethical principle E protects clients' rights to enhance client autonomy. Limiting or interfering with client autonomy violates this basic principle. Reintegrative therapists respect clients' right to set their own therapy goals and to have access to evidence-based trauma resolution methods, which have been shown to trigger spontaneous sexuality changes as a byproduct. This distinction, among others, is another reason why reintegrative therapy cannot be categorized as so-called conversion therapy." End quote. It's worth noting, however, that RTA cites a paper by NARTH, a former pro-conversion therapy organization. That NARTH paper is used as the primary research and theoretical foundation in support of its efforts. The paper tellingly failed to make the distinction advocated by RTA. Rather, NARTH noted that conversion therapy has operated under a variety of names and has not been limited to the licensed therapeutic context. It said, quote, "The terms reparative, conversion, and reorientation are often used interchangeably in the literature. Practitioners of reparative therapy are typically trained in psychodynamic, if not psychoanalytic models. Conversion therapy is used commonly, but not exclusively, by critics of assisted sexual reorientation to refer to religiously as well as professionally mediated change efforts. Practitioners of reorientation therapies may be trained in one or more of the full spectrum of theoretical and practical approaches to psychotherapy. In the text, other than in direct quotes, we use reorientation therapy as the general term for all professional therapeutic approaches to assisted change in unwanted sexual orientation." End quote. So a definition of conversion therapy, limited to practice done without consent, runs afoul of general understandings by both its opponents and its advocates. Most argue that the practice is defined by the desired outcome facilitated by the professional, rather than by the question of consent. Many who identify themselves as victims of conversion therapy emphasize how they sought out professional help with a personal desire to achieve orientation change. Here, RTA may be seeking to establish a carve-out so that its practices are not associated with the term, and the research cited by RTA in support of its efforts suggests that the redefinition is more a matter of rebranding than substance. Focusing on consent also becomes complicated when one considers the environments leading many to conversion therapy, especially minors who may fear ostracization in their religious or social communities, or even be kicked out of their homes for being queer. Or consider specifically Catholic contexts, where a number of Catholic leaders state that homosexuals may not be admitted into the seminary, and a young man may be convinced of a calling to the priesthood and see his only hope for his vocation in conversion therapy. Nonetheless, no consistent definition exists for conversion therapy. Timothy Locke, a NARTH member and Catholic psychologist who served as the director of psychological sciences at the St. Joseph Seminary in the Archdiocese of New York, treats reparative therapy and conversion therapy synonymously and does not include coercion within his definition. He says, reparative therapy or conversion therapy is defined as psychotherapy aimed at helping individuals change from experiencing same-sex attraction to opposite-sex attraction. Andrew Comiskey, founding director of Desert Stream Ministries, notes, "The term conversion therapy has been defined by lawmakers as any counseling, practice, or treatment performed with the goal of changing an individual's sexual attractions, behavior, or identity." However, Comiskey argues that the stigma associated with the term calls for the use of other terms by those who promote orientation change efforts, such as change-allowing therapy, sexual attraction fluidity exploration in therapy, or even just trauma therapy. The American Psychiatric Association, in its 2018 position statement on conversion therapy in LGBTQ patients, discusses conversion therapy solely in the psychiatric context, and likewise treats it synonymously with reparative therapy. It says, "Since 1998, the American Psychiatric Association has opposed any psychiatric treatment, such as reparative or conversion therapy, which is based upon the assumption that homosexuality per se is a mental disorder, or that a patient should change his or her homosexual orientation." The American Psychological Association has used the terms reparative therapy and conversion therapy interchangeably, identifying them as commonly used umbrella terms that include sustained efforts to discourage or change behaviors related to LGBTQ+ identities and expressions. Here, my discussion will not settle on one definition for the term conversion therapy. Instead, it will focus on a set of harmful theories which has driven the conversion or reparative or reintegrative therapy movement, understanding harmful practices not as the core problem, but as symptoms of harms rooted ultimately in ideology. So it will focus primarily on the history behind these harmful practices, the meaning of conversion therapy ideology, or the ex-gay narrative, as I often call it, and their impact on the Catholic Church. While acknowledging some nuances between the terms, this discussion will use conversion therapy, reparative therapy, and reintegrative therapy largely interchangeably, utilizing whichever term is most relevant for the time or figures being discussed. It will also consider conversion therapy broadly, treating it as an umbrella term encompassing practices such as psychotherapy, pastoral counseling, aversion therapy, shock treatments, healing ministries, and the like. So, let's get into the history. The history of conversion therapy is complex, and any effort to give a singular narrative for it will inevitably miss important nuances and context. A few narratives will be given here to help you all understand some important contours of the history of conversion therapy and to provide context for these discussions. For the purposes of this discussion, we will explore the psychiatric history of conversion therapy, related to and overlapping with, but distinct from the history of conversion therapy in the context of religious and spiritual healing movements, which will also be discussed, and eventually they will overlap. I'll use the divisions identified by Kenji Yoshino: the Freudian period, the Gilded Age of conversion therapy, and the Post-Stonewall period. A basic understanding of the history of psychoanalysis is also essential for understanding the trajectory of conversion therapy and the theories behind it. As psychiatrist and expert on the history and efficacy of conversion therapy, Jack Drescher writes, "The history of reparative therapies has become inexorably linked with that of psychoanalysis." Drescher also notes that the theoretical and methodological development of reparative therapy is linked to cultural and political movements, partly because various cultural and political movements served as a catalyst to draw attention to problematic aspects of conversion therapy, not entirely dissimilar to the ways in which cultural and political movements against clerical abuse have driven changes in practice and policy within the Catholic Church. And partly because mental health professionals, both those opposing and those defending conversion therapy, have been key figures in political and cultural movements impacting the LGBTQ community. Many have seen their roles as advocates to be necessarily tied to their work as support professionals. The historical relationship between psychoanalysis and medical or surgical interventions to cure homosexuality should also be acknowledged here. In its earliest forms, psychoanalysis was often not treated as distinct from medical practice. Psychoanalytic practitioners were originally medical doctors, and the distinction between psychological and medical practice largely came about following the work of Freud. Thus, in its earliest forms, conversion therapy did not see a strong distinction between medical or surgical interventions, and psychoanalysis aimed at cures. Shock therapy was understood to be a therapy, as were surgical interventions such as lobotomies aimed at eliminating same-sex sexual desires. Freud himself was educated and began his career in medicine. At the start of his career as a doctor treating neuroses, he attempted to treat through electrotherapy. After he failed in these efforts, he focused upon developing the field of hypnosis, and eventually he established his career in psychoanalysis. All of these practices would have been viewed as medical practice at the time, even if many in the medical profession then viewed Freud's developing psychoanalytic work with suspicion or even ridicule. As Freud's ideas continued to develop and gain wider acceptance, the gap between conversion therapy via shock and conversion therapy via psychoanalysis widened. Today, the former practice is often understood as entirely distinct from the latter, even if this has not been the case across history. These various practices share an important common lineage in the assumption that same-sex sexual desires come about due to a form of illness or irregular development, whether biological or psychological. This assumption fuels the drive for cures. Prior to Freud, some had attempted to change what we now call sexual orientation, especially homosexuality, through hypnosis or surgical procedures. Homosexuality was not considered in terms of mental pathology, and the psychological origins of same-sex desires were not considered except perhaps in philosophical terms. The focus on the psychological etiology of homosexuality is one which arises with the modern secular psychological tradition, beginning largely with Freud. Freud's views on homosexuality and sexuality generally are complex and easily misrepresented. I'll present here a high-level discussion of some of Freud's ideas on these matters, noting that much more can and should be said. Over the course of his career, Freud developed a narrative of psychosexual development whereby a child develops in a series of stages: the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latent stage, and the genital stage. In each stage, the child becomes aware of various bodily parts and bodily sensations and may experience developmental problems if the child develops fixations or does not learn to process bodily functions appropriately. At the phallic stage, according to Freud, children begin to notice bodily differences between men and women, boys and girls. This includes fears and anxieties related to the absence or presence of a penis, including the castration complex, whereby Freud says that boys notice women lack a penis, believe these women must have been castrated, and then begin to fear castration themselves. This, according to Freud, can lead to inhibitions towards women and be one of the pathways to become homosexual. Also at the phallic stage, as boys continue to mature, they encounter the Oedipus complex, whereby they develop a sexual attachment to their mothers and view their fathers as hostile sexual rival. A failure to eventually detach from their mother and identify with their father may also result in homosexuality. I should also note that for Freud, male homosexuality and lesbianism arise in distinct ways. For Freud, all people possess a certain bisexuality, and the homosexual component is sublimated during development, often put to social uses. Bisexuality is the norm for Freud, even if the same-sex component eventually will express itself differently from the opposite-sex component. But one can fail to develop in this way, as noted above, with homosexuality as a resultant symptom. Freud did not view homosexuality as immoral or necessarily as an illness, however. Rather, he characterized it as a variation of the sexual function, produced by a certain arrest of sexual development. But while Freud believed homosexuality could arise from an arrest in development, he did not believe that it could be cured or changed by making up for the developmental failure. He writes, in general, to undertake to convert a fully developed homosexual into a heterosexual does not offer much prospect of success than does the reverse. Jack Drescher writes that for Freud, homosexuality was not a neurosis, but a difficult-to-treat psychic disposition. Interestingly, Freud's views on homosexuality were not all that different from his views on religion. Freud had argued that God is nothing other than an exalted father, a being constructed as a result of certain social complexes. In Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices, Freud's earliest work on religion, he calls religion a universal obsessional neurosis. Freud's identification of the etiology of religion follows the same methods, frameworks, and dispositions that establish his etiology of homosexuality. But many Christians tend to fail to recognize this, wholesale condemning Freud's treatment of religion while largely adopting his treatment of homosexuality. If we consider a secular perspective, Freud's views can make sense. Catholics believe, for example, that in the Mass, a piece of bread is transubstantiated, into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of a man who died 2,000 years ago and also is God. From a secular point of view, it makes sense to assume that only people suffering from a neurosis would believe this. It seems way more crazy to believe that a piece of bread is God than to believe, for example, that someone with a male anatomy is actually a woman. The death of Freud in 1939 initiated what Drescher calls reparative therapy's Gilded Age. Freud himself has very restrained views regarding the ability of psychoanalysis to change homosexuality, but aspirations for and the influence of the psychological profession ballooned over the middle of the 20th century. This led to efforts of the psychological community to develop methods to change a variety of psychological experiences and dispositions. There is a dramatic expansion in the hopes for what psychoanalysis could cure, including homosexuality. A number of psychologists developed on Freud's view that homosexuality is a symptom of a failure of development, and sought ways to complete or resolve this failure in hopes that one side effect will be heterosexuality. This coincided with a number of related developments, including efforts of professionals to use recovered memories in criminal investigations, and also the Catholic Church's developing efforts to fix abuser priests through psychological or other interventions and then return them to ministry. Approaches to homosexuality differed slightly between psychologists assisting with orientation change during this period. Sandor Ratto argued that overly negative messages from parents regarding sex can lead to a fear of sex on the part of children and result in homosexuality. Irving Bieber argued that homosexuality occurs because of a failure of development, such that the homosexuality is a form of immaturity. Charles Socarides argued that homosexuality is not necessarily a result of developmental arrest, but a neurotic symptom of a conflict between the ego and the id resulting from having a weak father. Lionel Alvise, moving in a different direction, argued that homosexuality arises due to a phobia of the opposite sex, that this is resolved by seeking sexual intercourse with the opposite sex, and that a failure to be cured of homosexuality occurs because of a lack of commitment to change. From Freud's death through the 1960s, the view that homosexuality was pathological and could be cured became part of the mainstream of the psychological profession, driven partly through professionals associated with Columbia University's Psychoanalytic Clinic for Training and Research. research. A key study during this period was Homosexuality, a Psychoanalytic Study, published in 1962 and involving 77 psychiatrists and 206 homosexual and heterosexual patients. The study explored ideological factors leading to homosexuality. What's significant, however, is that the study relies on an assumption not itself grounded in scholarly research. The paper states all psychoanalytic theories assume that homosexuality is psychopathologic. That is, this line of research proceeds from a fundamental assumption that's left unquestioned. The Gilded Age of conversion therapy involved a number of reversals from the Freudian period, including the shift from Freud's view that homosexuality was not a pathology to the assumption by Bieber and others that this is the primary way in which to understand homosexuality. Another shift involves the rejection of Freud's view that all heterosexuals possess a latent homosexual drive that has been sublimated, rejected, or repurposed. The 1962 homosexuality study asserted the precise opposite, that every homosexual is in reality a latent heterosexual. The supporting evidence for this claim is scant. It notes that 30% of the 106 homosexual patients in the study identified as bisexual, that about half of the non-bisexual group had at least one experience in heterosexual intercourse, and that almost half of the homosexuals reported erotic heterosexual activity in dreams, compared to about 1/4 of the heterosexual patients who reported erotic homosexual activity in dreams. The study fails to seriously consider the myriad of ways in which this data can be interpreted or framed, focusing only on the ways it can be used to support assumptions undergirding it. Nonetheless, the study's findings on the possibility of orientation change are modest. 57% of the exclusive homosexuals were still exclusive homosexuals after treatment. 19% reported a shift to bisexuality, and only 19% reported a change to exclusive heterosexuality. One should note that these conclusions arise at a time when the psychological profession is most open to sexual orientation change efforts. As with much of American culture regarding homosexuality, a significant change came with the Stonewall riots of 1969. The fundamental assumptions of the Gilded Age of conversion therapy began to be seriously questioned, critiqued, or outright rejected. In 1952, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-1, had listed homosexuality as a mental disorder. The period following Stonewall led to increased visibility of the gay community, as well as the broader LGBTQ+ community, whose prominent advocates argued that the accounts of homosexuality as pathology were inventions of a group of professionals negatively biased against homosexuals. As a historical matter, they were right. These pathological accounts were inventions of modern secular psychologists. In 1973, homosexuality was then removed from the DSM-3 as a pathology. Thus began the post-Stonewall period of reparative therapy, where the primary support for conversion or reparative therapy came not from major psychological bodies, but from Christian and other religious communities. Interestingly, the support for pathological narratives, which were developed by a profession which had viewed religion as a form of neurosis, were lifted from that profession and taken up by these religious institutions. To be sure, a number of professional psychologists continue to support pathological approaches to homosexuality, though Drescher notes that their approaches began to move away from the scientific mainstream and more towards adopting mystical presuppositions. Elaine Siegel, basing much of her work on the ideas developed by Socarides, argued that homosexuality arises because of a desire to heal attractions to those who meet certain bodily ideals. But she seemed to establish herself through invention rather than serious attention to her profession. Drescher notes how she defined the psychoanalytic concept of narcissism as an energy which allows individuals to adapt to the reality of life, the cathexis of life. She does not join the rest of her profession in attentiveness to the limits of personal objectivity, working from an inflative sense of her own capacity for neutrality. And she presents her clinical narratives as historical facts that she has unearthed in the course of analysis. As reparative therapy moves into the 21st century, Drescher identifies how many of its professional advocates lack an awareness of their profession's developments, as well as intellectual rigor and scholarly awareness. In the work of Joseph Nicolosi, moves away from the psychological profession continue with what Drescher identifies as a deliberate fusion of spiritual and psychoanalytic thought. Nicolosi, as well as other psychologists seeking to ground theories in support of reparative therapy, move away from psychological research and more towards esoteric theorizing. As the scholarly and evidentiary support for their positions continues to weaken, they increasingly rely on commitments to a shrinking set of theories, narratives, and anecdotal accounts of their own work with clients. Drescher says that in much of his work, Nicolosi argues not as a scientist but as a preacher, misusing psychological concepts and overusing stereotypes of gay people. For example, Nicolosi writes in Reparative Therapy of Male Homosexuality, quote, "Gay couples are characteristically brief and very volatile, with much fighting, arguing, making up again, and continual disappointments. They may take the form of intense romances where the attraction remains primarily sexual, characterized by infatuation and never evolving into mature love, or else they settle into long-term friendships while maintaining outside affairs. Research, however, reveals that they almost never possess the mature elements of quiet consistency, trust, mutual dependency, and sexual fidelity characteristic of highly functioning heterosexual marriages," end quote. Nicolosi cites no sources when making this argument. As one proceeds further into that chapter of his book, Nicolosi does cite research, but the majority of it is more than 10 years old, with one study being 40 years old at the time. Nicolosi makes no note of how cultural acceptance of various lifestyles may impact the health of relationships, and he does not compare same-sex relationships to opposite-sex relationships generally, but only highly functioning heterosexual marriages. If you were to make a fair comparison, it would be a comparison of highly functioning same-sex long-term relationships to highly functioning heterosexual marriages. But he doesn't do that, and his failure to recognize these problems speaks to the seriousness of his work. Nonetheless, Nicolosi speaks at times without qualification, even saying during one event, homosexuality is always prompted by an inner sense of loneliness. Even Nicolosi's own clients, such as Scott Hare, have spoken about his use of caricature and how this eventually led them to reject his theories altogether. Nicolosi worked with a number of other professionals in 1992 to found the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, or NARTH, an organization for mental health professionals grounded in the assumption that obligatory homosexuality is a treatable disorder and that homosexuality is an illness. In 2014, NARTH was rebranded as the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, or ATCSI. It continues to operate today, but is not recognized by any major professional organization. As he himself has stated, much of Nicolosi's own treatment for homosexual clients is based upon the psychoanalytic writings of Dr. Elizabeth Moberly. Father John Harvey, the founder of the Catholic organization Courage International, has referred to Moberly as the most important person in identifying the origins and treatments of homosexuality. Moberly is best known for her 1983 text, Homosexuality, A New Christian Ethic. The book focuses on the root causes of homosexuality, with its core argument being that the homosexual condition involves legitimate developmental needs, the fulfillment of which has been blocked by an underlying ambivalence to members of the same sex. It picks up on the neo-Freudian tradition that homosexuality depends on difficulties in the parent-child relationship, especially in the earlier years of life. Moberly coined the term same-sex ambivalence, which she says develops when a child cannot develop a healthy attachment to the same-sex parent and develops a defensive detachment to that parent. She argues that the repression of this need for attachment results in a reparative urge that is involved in the homosexual impulse, a seeking after members of the same sex to make good earlier deficits in the parent-child relationship. There is a dual drive resulting from same-sex ambivalence, by which one both longs after the same sex and also bears hostility towards authority of those of the same sex. Moberly prescribes a reparative process. She writes that affirmative non-sexual relationships with members of the same sex can heal deficits in the relational capacity and can be so fulfilling that same-sex deficits remain no longer and the relationship itself is outgrown. She argues that this healing may take a considerable amount of time. This understanding of reparative therapy is important. What distinguishes this type of therapy is not the desire to turn homosexual desires into heterosexual desires. Rather, reparative therapy is premised on the view that homosexual desires evidence a need to respond to deficits in development or identity. According to the definition set by Nicolosi, Moberly, and others during this period, a person may be engaging in reparative therapy even if they aren't explicitly seeking the diminishment of homosexual desires and the development of heterosexual desires. Indeed, for Nicolosi, Moberly, and others, the shift in desires isn't the point of reparative therapy. The point is to heal or enable proper development, which would provide as a side effect a move into heterosexuality. One should note a few things about the work of Elizabeth Moberly. First, though she is often referred to as a psychologist by those citing her, She did not complete any studies or carry any credentials in psychology. Her studies, rather, were in theology. In a public event where someone asked Moberly about the success of her methods, Moberly responded, "I can give you a hope, but I can't give you a head count." This is because her research did not involve psychotherapy with any persons experiencing homosexual desires. It also did not receive peer review from professionals in the psychological professions. So her work may be considered theoretical rather than scientific or evidence-based, and is a work of Christian theory rather than professional psychology. It was a theory that hadn't been tested, but it was quickly adopted as the truth of reality. Alongside Leanne Payne, who will be discussed later, Elizabeth Moberly is probably the most influential non-Catholic when it comes to popular Catholic approaches to homosexuality. Today, reparative therapy continues to be practiced by a subset of licensed mental health professionals. Some, such as Joseph Nicolosi Jr., son of the founder of NARTH, have rebranded their efforts with terms such as reintegrative therapy. Nonetheless, their approaches and groundings remain substantially the same. Alongside the development of psychoanalysis, the United States saw the development of the Christian prayer healing movement over the 20th century. This begins with healing revivals and the charismatic renewal in the United States in the early 1900s. The charismatic renewal, as Catholics often refer to it today, originated in Pentecostal forms of prayer and then spread to a number of mainline Protestant denominations and then into Catholicism. It's particularly relevant here. Out of these, a number of movements such as the Deliverance Prayer Movement and the Listening Prayer Movement began. Agnes Sanford is considered to be the mother of the inner healing movement. In 1945, she published The Healing Light, The Art and Method of Spiritual Healing, which is considered to be one of the movement's foundational texts. In it, she outlines how to unlock the power of God through prayer to heal ailments, whether they be spiritual, psychological, or physical. She writes, "It is for us to learn His will and to seek the simplicity and beauty of the laws that set free His power." The book presents a formulaic approach to drawing out the power of God. It says, quote, "This book suggests for those willing to learn a method so simple that it is childlike, as the more profound truths are apt to be. It is an experimental method. One decides upon a definitive subject for prayer, prays about it, and then decides whether or not the prayer project succeeds. If it does not succeed, one seeks a better adjustment with God and tries again." End quote. Sanford attracted many followers and established schools of pastoral care. In 1964, Richard Winkler was the pastor of the Church of the Resurrection in the Anglican Church's Diocese of Chicago. He himself was a follower of Sanford, hosting prayer circles and passing Sanford's work on to others. That year, he met Leanne Payne, whom he introduced to Sanford's prayer healing ministry. Payne served with Sanford in her schools of pastoral care and began full-time ministry in 1973, writing and performing healing prayer herself. In 1981, Payne published The Broken Image, which focused on the healing of homosexuality and reorientation to heterosexuality through healing prayer. This book made her a seminal figure in Christian efforts to cure homosexuality through prayer. Drawing largely on the work of the Christian psychiatrist Frank Lake and her own experience in ministry, Payne presents a view of homosexuality consistent with Neo-Freudian tradition. In The Broken Image, she presents a narrative of female homosexuality where the infant is attached to the mother and then must go through a process of emotional and physical separation. When the attachment was not originally able to occur, the child seeks out attachment from others in ways that could result in lesbianism. Healing from homosexuality for Payne involves the healing of memories. She identifies the origins of homosexuality usually in a repressed memory or insecurity that must be brought forward and healed by the grace of God in prayer. She reports consistent success in providing this healing to men and women experiencing homosexuality. According to Payne, what is required is sincerity in prayer. She writes, "If sincerely desired and prayed for, the petition for pastoral answers will bring the Church's healing gifts to the fore." Among those who came to Payne for healing was Mario Bergner, who alleged a prayer experience in a hospital room had cured him of both AIDS and homosexuality. Bergner then worked with Payne to start Redeemed Lives Ministry, an organization dedicated to ministering to people's needs for healing, including for sexual brokenness. We'll return to Bergner later in this discussion. Payne's work came into popularity alongside the prominence of repressed memory theory, which held that some traumatic experiences could be so overwhelming that the victim would use defense mechanisms to repress and forget them. Growing out of the Freudian psychoanalytic movement and influenced by the work of hypnotists such as Jean-Marc Cardot, repressed memory theory held that these memories could be recovered through therapy and other techniques. In short, repressed memory theory holds that people repress traumatic experiences, the repressed content has psychopathological potential, and recovering traumatic content is necessary for engendering symptom relief. One of the most publicized instances of the issue of recovered memory is the Thurston County ritual abuse case, in which both Christian spiritual leaders and law enforcement used various forms of repressed memory theory to extract allegations of and confessions to ritual sexual abuse. In the context of the spiritual healing movement and the reparative therapy movements, various forms of repressed memory theory have been used to uncover wounds or insecurities that had resulted in the development of homosexual desires. We'll come back to that case later. The most prominent organization for conversion therapy in the United States, Exodus International, institutionally brought together both the spiritual and psychological movements for conversion therapy. Exodus was founded in 1976 and became a multinational ministry focused on promoting the message of freedom from homosexuality through the prayer of Jesus Christ, largely through referrals for various forms of conversion therapy and conferences supporting Christian sexual orientation change efforts. It grew to an organization with an annual operating budget of $1 million, with more than 400 local ministries in 17 countries. Exodus was affiliated with NARTH and required any members of its referral network to uphold its policy positions, including that Christ offers a healing alternative to those with homosexual tendencies that entails the freedom to grow into heterosexuality, that reorientation requires motivation and personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and that reparative therapy, a holistic counseling approach to addressing unwanted same-sex attraction, can be a beneficial tool. By 2009, Exodus was promoting itself as the largest evangelical organization dealing with homosexuality in the world today. Among the affiliates of Exodus International was Desert Stream Ministries, a Missouri-based ministry focused on providing healing to the sexually and relationally broken. Desert Stream was founded in 1980 by Andy Comiskey, arising out of Comiskey's, as he put it, journey out of homosexuality and into his true identity in Jesus Christ. Following in the tradition of Leanne Payne, whom he cites as a major influence, Comiskey does not operate out of psychological credentials, but out of his work as a pastor and Christian leader. In 2011, Comiskey converted to Catholicism. While a number of dioceses have engaged Comiskey and Desert Stream to train clergy and other Catholic leaders, he has clarified that his ministry has not become Catholic and mostly serves evangelical churches. Such organizations have not been limited to evangelicals, however. Jews Offering New Alternatives for Healing, or JONAH, operated as an organization dedicated to educating the worldwide Jewish community about the social, cultural, and emotional factors which lead to same-sex attractions. Through psychological and spiritual counseling, peer support, and self-empowerment, JONAH sought to reunify families, to heal the wounds surrounding homosexuality, and to provide hope. Conversion therapy ideology continues to manifest itself through both professional reparative therapy and through prayer healing ministries. These efforts often occur alongside camps or retreats operating under the same ex-gay narrative. The most popular of these is the Journey into Manhood program. In 2002, two Mormons named Rich Weiler and David Matheson created an experiential weekend program for men conflicted over their same-sex attractions. Weiler had previously created a network of like-minded individuals through People Can Change, a website promoting stories of people who have come out of homosexuality. Matheson was a prominent conversion therapist, seen as an early protege of Joseph Nicolosi. Among other ideas, People Can Change held, quote, "We experience this profound change by uncovering and healing the underlying pain and alienation from men, masculinity, and God that we found had caused so much of our homosexual symptoms to begin with," end quote. While Journey into Manhood, their experiential weekend program, did not hold that homosexuality is a mental disorder or mental illness, or that it could be easily changed, it did promote that significant and lasting change, healing, and growth could result through masculine connection, rigorous authenticity, genuine need fulfillment, and courageous surrender. The Journey into Manhood program consisted of a series of exercises, 48 hours of what it referred to as deep emotional work. This consisted largely of outdoor team-building exercises, inner child exercises, and role-play activities, often involving participants interacting with simulated male figures in their lives. It operated under the premise that engaging in masculine affirming and healing activities could work towards a gradual healing of homosexuality. It also included controversial activities, such as touch therapy and group nudity. It's important to note that Journey into Manhood has since updated its program to now prohibit nudity in its exercises today, but that was a prominent part of its activities in the past. This discussion will return to Rich Weiler and Journey into Manhood in discussing the long-term harms and outcomes of this program. But first, let's talk about the ex-gay narrative. The sexual orientation change efforts of the psychological community and the prayer healing movement of the last century come together in a number of Catholic figures in the 21st century, as will be discussed in the next section. What's important to note is how these efforts, while involving divergent approaches to homosexuality, converge in an underlying ideology, that same-sex attractions arise due to a wound, and that they might be changed to heterosexual desires if one heals that wound. The wound may consist of a failure of development, an insecurity, or a trauma. I often refer to that narrative, that ideology concerning the origins and healing of same-sex desires, as the ex-gay narrative or conversion therapy ideology. The harm most directly addressed by this discussion is not necessarily efforts to change sexual orientation, but the ideology imprinted upon those subjected to such efforts, whether or not they are voluntarily sought. The ex-gay narrative, or conversion therapy ideology, may manifest in a variety of forms, from reparative therapy or rebranded versions of such therapy, healing ministries or retreats, pastoral counseling, or even self-help books. When it comes to the Catholic Church, the prevalence of conversion therapy ideology cannot be overstated. The most obvious example is the reliance upon Desert Stream's ministry for training leaders by Catholic institutions such as the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, the Archdiocese of Denver, and others. These trainings focus on enabling Catholics to become healers. Desert Stream's trainings generally focus on healing in the tradition of Agnes Sanford and Leanne Payne, utilizing prayer groups or other forms of prayer to enable psychological, spiritual, or other change. Archbishop Samuel Aquila himself promoted these theories during a private conference with Comiskey and clergy of his diocese, saying, "It is believing in the power and authority of Jesus Christ and that he can heal any wound, he can forgive any sin, he can heal any disorder, if we truly put our faith in him and our trust and confidence in him." And what Living Waters, a program provided by Desert Streams, does is it really helps us to submit ourselves to God and put our faith in God. End quote. Bob Schutz, the founder of the John Paul II Healing Center, grounds his ideas concerning homosexuality, sexuality, and healing in the work of Leanne Payne. In the John Paul II Healing Center's Freedom and Victory workshop, provided to seminarians at the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, Schutz utilizes prayer healing methods developed from the Protestant prayer healing movement. For example, the workshop's manual requires participants to identify sins and traumas that occurred in the past 4 to 6 generations in your family, and to pray for renouncing generational sins and resisting generational curses. Among the sins and curses listed are homosexuality and lesbianism, repeated miscarriages, and family members dying by suicide. This section of the manual cites the work of Payne as its primary source. The John Paul II Healing Center for decades has provided required seminarian workshops for the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. Likewise, Schutz's contributions to the book Living the Truth in Love, Pastoral Approaches to Same-Sex Attraction includes the story of Tom, a man who shared that he had been looking at homosexual pornography. Schutz directs Tom through a prayer exercise where he verbally asks the Holy Spirit to make it clear how this memory was related to Tom's shame. Hearing this, Tom explores his history and provides to Schutz a narrative of failing to receive affirmation from his father. Schutz directs Tom through a prayer experience that facilitates healing, and Schutz says that Tom has since begun planning getting married to a woman. I previously discussed the work of Mario Bergner, an Anglican former homosexual who began a ministry supporting those seeking healing from homosexuality. Bergner's popular lecture, A Christian Response to Homosexuality, provided a basis for Christopher West's conception of his own same-sex desires and his understanding of homosexuality, as West shares in his book Good News About Sex and Marriage. West writes about how a conference which featured Bergner helped him make sense of his own troubling inner dynamic related to experiencing same-sex desires, which West frames as a painful period of questioning his masculine identity. In his section on homosexuality, West cites David Morrison's book Beyond Gay, Bergner's lecture, and multiple books by Leanne Payne. The ex-gay narrative provides the framework for West's approach to homosexuality in Good News, which has been part of the required reading for West's marriage preparation course implemented in more than 40 U.S. dioceses. Father Mike Schmitz, host of the popular The Bible in a Year podcast, published Made for Love, Same-Sex Attraction and the Catholic Church in 2018. Made for Love centers on treating homosexuality as a kind of wound. Notably, the primary recommendations he provides for further reading are two texts, Why I Don't Call Myself Gay by Daniel Mattson and The Battle for Normality by Gerard van den Aardbig. I'll talk more about Mattson later. Aardbig is a Catholic reparative therapist, and the subtitle for his book is A Guide for Self-Therapy for Homosexuality. In his work, Aardbig makes use of the ex-gay narrative and relies on outdated or retracted research. Courage International, the largest Catholic ministry for those who experience same-sex attraction, is thoroughly grounded in ex-gay narratives. In The Truth About Homosexuality, Courage founder Father John Harvey argues that the psychological elements are predominant in the formation of a homosexual orientation, citing the work of both Moberly and Payne. In exploring the possibility of change of orientation, Harvey directs the reader to Exodus International and its leadership, as well as to Homosexuals Anonymous, an ex-gay organization promoting conversion therapy. Harvey argues that the rate of reorientation is no longer low for those who make the effort. Identifying but rejecting alternative positions, Harvey privileges and chronicles the findings of reparative therapists and ex-gay advocates he supports, ultimately concluding that change from a homosexual orientation to heterosexuality can occur for some through a process of prayer, group support, and sound therapy. In 1997, Moberly called Harvey a hero of the ex-gay movement. It's worth noting, however, that he presents more modest views than others and states that not everyone who seeks such change is able to attain it. Some have erroneously argued that the clergy abuse crisis is due to a prevalence of gay priests, but they miss an important connection between the clergy abuse crisis and the ex-gay narrative: the belief in the malleability of desire and sexual orientation by therapeutic or other efforts. Father John Harvey had publicly argued that abuser priests should be returned to public ministry if they had received appropriate therapeutic or other treatment. He offers as a model an abuser priest who has truly internalized the 12-step program so that he keeps himself at a distance from any unsupervised contact with youth. For Harvey, what is most central in the matter of an abuser priest is not what they have done to their victims, but whether psychological or other interventions can resolve the psychological conditions leading to their abuse. Harvey demonstrated a dangerous enthusiasm about the ability to do away with various proclivities and inclinations through psychological or other interventions. This view clearly carried over into the work of Courage, which did not demonstrate serious concern for past abuse. In 1986, Colin Cook resigned from Homosexuals Anonymous after a public scandal in which a dozen of his male clients accused him of sexual abuse. By 1988, it had been publicly reported that Cook had given one of his ministry members a nude massage while at an Exodus conference. Yet 2 years later, in 1990, Courage invited Cook to be a keynote speaker at its annual conference. The obfuscation by Courage mirrors much of the Catholic Church in response to abuse scandals. In 2018, Courage issued a public statement in response to the sexual abuse allegations against Father Donald Timone, who the statement identified as a friend and collaborator of Courage as well as a chaplain. Courage failed to acknowledge that Timone had served as interim executive director over the entire ministry and was regularly featured as a keynote speaker at its conferences. Similarly, allegations arose in 2019 that popular Courage speaker, contributor to Living the Truth in Love, and author of Why I Don't Call Myself a Gay Catholic, Dan Mattson, had engaged in a multi-year online sexual relationship with a child. Again, Father Mike Schmitz lists Mattson as one of his 2 referred works in his book Made for Love. While Mattson no longer does speaking events with Courage, his work has continued to be promoted on the resources page of the Courage website. In some ways, Courage has moved away from conversion therapy promotion. At its founding, Courage was programmatically modeled off of Alcoholics Anonymous, treating homosexuality as a form of addiction in need of healing. For many, this placed Courage within the ex-gay movement. In 2005, Focus on the Family's Steve Jordahl called Courage the ex-gay Catholic ministry. In 2013, Courage had a webpage for related websites that included Narth, Homosexuals Anonymous, Jonah, People Can Change, and ex-gay links. By 2015, however, Courage had quietly removed this page and added to its website, reparative therapy is a psychological process that attempts to increase heterosexual inclinations. Courage neither requires nor endorses any method of reparative therapy. Nonetheless, even after that time, the Courage website had maintained a suggested reading list by former executive director Father Paul Chek that recommends books such as Nicolosi's A Parent's Guide to Preventing Homosexuality and Ardbig's Self-Guide for Sexual Orientation Change. And even through the 2020s, Courage has included reparative therapists and ex-gay advocates as speakers at its annual conference. Finally, Father Anthony Anitrella is notable for his position of prominence in the Church. He served as a consultant to the Pontifical Council for the Family and is reported to have assisted in preparing the 2005 instructions concerning the criteria for the discernment of vocations, which barred admittance to the seminary for any men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies. In his reflections on the instruction, Anitrella argued that homosexuality results from a lack of plenitude and an immaturity of human sexuality, an attempt to consolidate his own sexuality identity. Nicknamed the Church's Shrink, seminarians and monasteries in Europe for years sent students struggling with homosexuality to him for therapy, where he would work to heal them, telling at least one client, "You're not gay, you just think you are." Following in the same vein as others here, Anitrella viewed homosexuality as a failure to develop, a lack in a man's ability to consolidate his masculine identity, where homosexuality is a form of narcissism. He operated under these theories to help his clients heal from their homosexuality. We'll return to Anitrella along with many others in the next section. So, how has all this resulted in harm? The inherent problems for the ex-gay narrative and Catholic institutions' reliance upon it is its use of half-narratives. The vast majority of the institutions and individuals listed above proceed on trajectories that involve admitting to falsehoods. Mario Bergner, whose lecture had so impacted Christopher West and was also cited in Good News, shared in 2018 that he had been divorced by his wife and had been using gay porn and engaging in same-sex sexual behavior. Redeemed Lives Ministry had also removed him from leadership. The period of booming ex-gay organizations has largely come to an end. In 2013, Exodus International's leadership decided to shut down the ministry, admitting that it had contributed to harms experienced by those who came to it for help, and apologized for promoting reparative therapy and other sexual orientation change efforts. In 2019, Jonah was also shut down after findings that it had engaged in consumer fraud. This was nearly 10 years after reports that Alan Downing, a therapist for Jonah and counselor for Journey into Manhood, had male clients masturbate in front of him as part of their healing process. In 2019, David Matheson, one of Nicolosi's proteges and co-founder of Journey into Manhood, left Journey into Manhood, divorced his wife, and came out as gay. Homosexuals Anonymous eventually removed its founder after those allegations arose that he had engaged in sexual activity with his reparative therapy clients. Others have begun sharing their experiences, including some with me personally. In 2021, Christopher Dowling shared his story of unsuccessful pursuits of sexual orientation change with Bob Schutz. Danny Peterson has shared his unsuccessful attempts at orientation change in studying the work of Leanne Payne and working with the Catholic reparative therapist Philip Mango. Scott Hare has shared his unsuccessful pursuit of healing with Joseph Nicolosi. Jack Drescher had seen a number of Nicolosi's past clients. The New York Times reported on it in 2017. It said, quote, "Jack Drescher, a psychiatrist who had written about conversion therapy and spoken to some of Dr. Nicolosi's former clients, said in an interview that Dr. Nicolosi's approach was to train patients to learn a storyline about who did something to them in childhood as a way to feel less bad about themselves, but the story often had no basis in fact. And learning to recite the story didn't lead to changes in their sexual orientation," Drescher said. Drescher said, "I've met a lot of people who've been through these treatments, and the setup is always that if change is going to happen, you, the patient, are going to have to make it happen, which leads to patient blaming when the treatment doesn't work." Bridget Eileen Rivera notes that religious faith is linked to a decreased risk of suicide for nearly every demographic except one, LGBTQ people. She relies on a 2018 study of more than 21,000 young adults in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine. The study found that heterosexual youth were at a lower risk for suicide if religion was more important to them, but gay and lesbian young adults for whom religion is important are 38% more likely to have had recent suicidal thoughts than those for whom religion is not important. Those who identified as questioning and for whom religion is important were almost 3 times more likely to have had a recent suicide attempt. Alongside these findings are recent studies on the impacts of sexual orientation change efforts. In 2020, the American Journal of Public Health published a survey of the generations data from more than 1,500 adults. The survey found that experiencing sexual orientation change efforts correlated with nearly twice the odds of lifetime suicidal ideation and 88% increased odds of suicide attempt. Among the most visible critics of studies finding a correlation between sexual orientation change efforts and behavioral harm is the Catholic priest and sociologist D. Paul Sullins. But multiple publications by Sullins in the area of homosexuality have misrepresented data or included methodological errors. Based on a review of the existing scholarly research, in 2021, the American Psychological Association determined that sexual orientation change lacks sufficient basis in scientific principles, and the proponents of sexual orientation change efforts often misrepresent research or mistake sexual fluidity for the ability to change sexual orientation. Fluidity is not the same as manipulation. Among the most horrifying cases is that of the church's shrink, Anthony Anatrella, who I discussed earlier. In the early 2000s, men who had seen Anatrella for therapy began to come forward with allegations of abuse during sessions, accusing Anatrella of manipulating them into body therapies leading to sexual abuse. Like Cook, Anatrella groomed the men by insisting that these body therapies were a way of affirming their masculine identity, making use of reparative therapies to abuse. But it wasn't until 2018 that Anatrella was restricted from ministry following an investigation by church authorities. Problems abound for reparative therapy or prayer healing focused on recovering memories, as is the focus of much of the work of Payne, Schutz, and others. This practice runs afoul of recent psychological findings. As a general matter, the psychological community has moved away from a focus on repressed memories and treatment. Experts have noted the dangers of professionals seeking out repressed memories and inadvertently manipulating clients to accept false memories. Indeed, research has found that false memory implantation can occur in just 2 or 3 interviews with a subject. Clinical psychologist David Lay writes on his experience, quote, "For 15 years, I've sat on national review panels where I examine and consult on licensing and malpractice claims against therapists and behavioral health clinicians. I've seen countless license actions and malpractice lawsuits against therapists who use recovered memory techniques, believing they were doing good. In every case I've ever seen the therapist lost, their actions deemed damaging, harmful, and contrary to industry practice." End quote. Unfortunately, many versions of the ex-gay narrative and reparative therapy that persist today rely on this outdated and discredited practice, perhaps because they do not have sufficient understanding or training or oversight to identify these problems. Recall, for example, in his session with Tom, the Catholic reparative therapist Bob Schutz induces Tom to ask Jesus to meet him in the place of his shame. Schutz connects the shame to certain events in the client's life that the client must uncover in therapy and ties this to the client's development of same-sex desires or other forms of sexual brokenness. Similar to recognized practitioners of repressed memory therapy, Schutz uses prayer to put his clients into a trance-like state where they would be more amenable to his influence, and then guides them to narratives that comport with his psychological theories, which he then frames as the promptings of God. Or consider the conclusion Schutz comes to for Ellen, a 16-year-old girl who is in a lesbian relationship. He says, "In prayer together, the Holy Spirit led us to uncover the 3 roots to our disordered desires, which came in the form of 3 memories." Certainly, LGBTQ+ people, like all people, have memories we would rather forget. At times, difficult memories may be avoided or repressed or hold events that contributed to ongoing psychological or spiritual problems. The problem with the ex-gay narrative, however, is the assumption of these when someone shares an experience of same-sex desire. This assumption may induce the acceptance of false memories or pressure individuals to make connections that don't exist. In his interview, Danny Peterson shared how he made up insecurities because of pressure he experienced at Journey into Manhood. Scott Hare shared how Nicolosi could not accept any experiences that did not match onto his ideology. In America Magazine, J. Frank Pate shared how his Catholic therapist pressured him to associate his sexual orientation with child abuse or alienation from his parents. Pate eventually became a poster child of orientation change for that therapist's seminars, but he ultimately came to admit that the reductive theories thrust upon him didn't work, and he now identifies as a survivor of conversion therapy. These men provide a cautionary tale when encountering advocates of the ability to heal homosexuality by these methods. For a time, Christopher Dowling was once a strong advocate for the John Paul II Healing Center and its ability to heal people like him who had sexual brokenness resulting in homosexuality. Dowling now recognizes that he was desperately seeking a way out of his homosexuality and came to accept this form of healing out of a sort of desperation. The psychiatrist George K. Ganaway has similarly said that repressed memory therapy is at a higher risk of leading to false memories or conclusions for those who are particularly vulnerable. Quote, "When individuals are highly hypnotizable, they may spontaneously enter auto-hypnotic trance states, particularly during stressful interview situations. Experimental hypnosis evidence indicates that memories retrieved in a hypnotic trance state are likely to contain a combination of both fact and fantasy, in a mixture that cannot be accurately determined without external corroboration. Furthermore, hypnosis increases the subject's confidence in the veracity of both correct and incorrect recalled material." End quote. Commenting on this in The New Yorker, Lawrence Wright says, "There was thus an obvious danger that an unwary therapist might unconsciously guide patients to conclusions that already existed in the therapist's mind. These are not new positions. Ganaway made the above statement at the 1991 convention for the American Psychological Association. Nonetheless, even today, practitioners of various forms of reparative therapy or healing prayer are not attentive to these dynamics and dangers. And for those like Schutz who are trained psychologists but do not operate under a license, there are no external mechanisms for accountability. Among other problems, the use of repressed memory theory or other theories supporting conversion therapy ideology can cause a high degree of destabilization and fragmentation of one's sense of self. One may feel pressure to conform to false realities, inventing experiences or insecurities to please the conversion therapist or prayer healer, or out of a strong desire to find a clear solution to a complex internal struggle. This is the essence of ideology, an oversimplified explanation that refuses to engage the complexity of reality. This is the reason provided by Paul Ingram, the man named as a satanic ritual abuser in the Thurston County case previously mentioned. According to a profile in The New Yorker, Ingram accepted false memories because they helped him explain to himself why a man who was so ostensibly a good Christian and a loving parent could have mistreated his children. He was repeatedly assured that he would remember the abuse once he confessed to it. But by the time he realized it was a false memory, partly through a cult expert who had studied coercive police techniques and recognized the dangers of theories related to repressed memories, it was too late. The pressure provided by reparative therapy or attempts to heal homosexuality can be extremely damaging to a person's faith. If a prayer healer or Catholic therapist recommended by a church leader says that God has guided the person to the opportunity to heal their desires or to identify a key narrative in their lives, what are they to make of God when healing doesn't occur, or that narrative, upon further reflection, turns out to be false? When the therapist like Schutz says that his work is really just the facilitation of the power of God, what is one left to believe when the power of God ultimately turns out to be ineffective or false? For some, it leads to intense shame and a sense of failure and unworthiness before God. For others, it leads to a total destabilization of their faith, not only in the provider of reparative therapy, but in the church that drove them to it. This is the experience that has been shared again and again by survivors of reparative therapy or other manifestations of ex-gay narratives. From a psychological point of view, the harms of conversion therapy ideology are compounded by the fact that these practices often involve an intermingling of truth and falsehood. Individuals seeking sexual orientation change efforts do have wounds and insecurities beginning from childhood. What is overlooked by the ideology, however, is that all people have such wounds and insecurities. For the person subject to sexual orientation change efforts, the initial process of uncovering and addressing these can give a significant sense of liberation, one that all people should be able to feel. But this liberation becomes intermingled with false narratives and pathological accounts, which, once recognized, can create even more pain, confusion, and alienation from self than before. What was once experienced as a process of healing becomes intertwined with a process of harm, which can make subsequent therapy and internal processing much more challenging and inhibit the ability to trust those who might be able to help in the future. This can lead to a general distrust of spiritual and religious leaders and spaces. None of this is to question the intentions of Schutz or any other person utilizing conversion therapy ideology or these pseudoscientific practices. It's entirely possible that these individuals have the best of intentions and they really do want to help facilitate healing for others. However, regardless of their intentions, the harms arising out of these practices are serious and also avoidable. As David Matheson said, reflecting on his past providing reparative therapy and refusing to accept his own same-sex desires, I helped them continue to tell this lie to themselves. And I did that because I was telling the lie to myself, and we all meant well, but it didn't have to be this way. Finally, the acceptance of conversion therapy ideologies can damage the integrity of the church's theological position. For years, Anna Trella had written and spoken on homosexuality and the Catholic Church, arguing for a pathological view of homosexuality as a biblical and Catholic approach to the issue. But Father Philippe Lefebvre, a Dominican theologian, argued that Anna Trella's approach lacked sufficient grounding in either the biblical or Catholic tradition. In one article, Lefebvre responds to one of Anna Trella's books on homosexuality and argues that the only basis for Anna Trella's theological reflections and recommendations for ecclesial practice is his scientific understanding. In another article, Lefebvre criticizes Anna Trella's work, arguing that Freud should not be transferred without scrutiny to legitimize an ecclesial practice. Indeed, what Lefebvre asks of Anna Trella may be asked of many of the figures highlighted in this discussion. Lefebvre asks, is he speaking in the name of Freud or of Jesus Christ? The uncertainty shows that he is in fact speaking on his own behalf. Freud is his God and he gives himself as his prophet. As noted previously in this discussion, it's extremely important to note that the basis for reparative therapy and the ex-gay narrative is neither scientific research nor the Catholic theological tradition. Rather, they arise out of one strain of Neo-Freudian theory, which conflicted with Freud's own views, developed alongside and then intertwined with the principles of certain strains of the Protestant Christian prayer healing movement. It is certainly reasonable that at one point in history, both Christian leaders and secular professionals would consider the ways in which Freudian psychoanalysis might offer an explanation of the etiology of same-sex desires and establish theories for exploration. Such theories would then need to be reviewed against the data of experience for validation. Both participants and leaders of prayer healing ministries and reparative therapy providers have recanted past claims of success, at times following allegations of abuse or accompanying the collapse of ministry. Psychological research has found that those subjected to sexual orientation change efforts are at an increased risk for suicide. Failing to find validation and imposed by the many public stories of harm or falsification, conversion therapy and ex-gay theories should have been rejected by the Church as lacking at best and fatally dangerous at worst. Instead, reparative therapy has been rebranded as reintegrative therapy, and Pray the Gay Away has been rebranded as healing prayer. A failure to learn from the data of experience has transformed a theory into an ideology, with fatal consequences for some and deep psychological harm for many. So what does this mean for the Catholic Church? Is the Church fatally flawed, incapable of offering anything of value to LGBTQ+ people? I don't think so. The Catholic Church need not find itself committed to neo-Freudian pseudoscience or spiritually manipulative approaches to prayer when it comes to grappling with the matter of homosexuality. The Church's moral tradition precedes modern psychology by centuries, and so the Church has a long tradition on which it may build, integrating with its approach to human development the lessons of modern psychology, including lessons arising from its failures. Among other things, the Church's moral tradition can provide a corrective to the excesses of the ex-gay movement. In Living the Truth in Love, Schutz writes that underneath every disordered desire, whether towards the same or opposite sex, there resides a healthy need that remains unmet. Though Schutz purports to be writing out of a Catholic worldview in his essay, this sentence betrays him. When the Catechism calls lust a disordered desire or masturbation a disordered action, the Catechism is not providing a pathological diagnosis of an unmet need. All that the Catechism means is that sexuality is ordered towards certain ends, and lust and masturbation are not directed towards those ends. Schutz's replacement of ends with needs shifts the focus of the Catholic treatment of order and disorder from the philosophical teleology to neo-Freudian accounts of psychosexual development. By moving away from this latter focus and rejecting the ex-gay narrative, the Church can provide a stronger focus on its own theological tradition. In addition to this, Schutz presents a view of the human person that goes against the Church's understanding of concupiscence, the enduring inclination to sin that, in this life, never ceases leading us into evil. Concupiscence is overcome not by scrutinizing one's history to resolve unmet needs, but by an ongoing struggle against sin supported by grace. Schutz, like other reparative therapists, provides a reductive account of the human person and an alternative to Christian anthropology. The Church's theological tradition can offer a corrective. The Catechism teaches that homosexuality's psychological genesis remains largely unexplained. For the vast majority of the Church's history, the psychological genesis of homosexuality was not even a topic of conversation. Brent Pickett writes of the Third Lateran Council's condemnation of homosexual acts in 1179. Quote, "The key category here is the sodomite, which differs from the contemporary idea of homosexual. A sodomite was understood as act-defined rather than as a type of person. Someone who had desires to engage in sodomy yet did not act upon them was not a sodomite. Also, persons who engaged in heterosexual sodomy were also sodomites. A person who had engaged in sodomy yet had repented of his sin, vowed to never do it again, was no longer a sodomite." End quote. Leanne Payne recognizes this in The Broken Image. She writes, "Before Freud and the advent of serious study of the unconscious components of man's behavior, those within the Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as most in the Western world, viewed homosexuality almost exclusively in moral and even to some degree in criminal terms." End quote. Payne herself seems to recognize that her approach to homosexuality departs from the focus of the Church for the vast majority of its history. There was not a focus on pathology or types of persons, but on particular acts. Psychological origins of the desires to engage in these acts were not relevant. Instead, the church focused on acts themselves. The theories discussed above do not originate from the Christian tradition, but from the tradition of psychoanalysis beginning with Freud. These theories have been adopted by Christian thinkers, writers, and mental health professionals, attached haphazardly to biblical accounts of the human person, and continue today, despite the catastrophic effects they have had on the lives of so many. Today, the church can join the many professional bodies that have rejected ex-gay narratives, focusing on the integration and slow development of the present constellation of a person's desires, rather than inventing origin stories in an attempt to change them. The church can let go of overly prescriptive approaches to homosexuality or LGBTQ+ identity, instead asking Christians to clarify the contours of their desires and identities, helping them to shape these in ways consistent with their Christian commitments. The church need not commit itself to pseudoscience in order to uphold its tradition.